Hey everybody, it's Erik, co-founder, partner of Village Global, a network-driven venture firm. And this is Venture Stories, a podcast covering topics relating to tech and business with world-leading experts. Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Venture Stories by Village Global. I'm here today joined by two very special guests, Immad Akhund, co-founder CEO of Mercury, and Jude Gomila, co-founder CEO of Golden. Jude, Immad, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
So one of the things I want to talk to you about, we're doing this episode at the end of March. Coronavirus is obviously on everyone's minds. Let's talk about some of the second or third order effects or some of the things or conversations that we're not having but should be having. Jude, why don't we start with you? What's most interesting or important or top of mind for you when we talk about this?
Yeah, I think what's top of mind for me in terms of these other order effects is the information lag that we're seeing between the conversations occurring on Twitter between all these different people, from technologists to epidemiologists to modelers and amateur hardware builders and software people and concerned medical people to the institutions that we have entrusted with large budgets like $4.5 billion for the WHO or more to go and solve these problems for us in the first place. And what we're seeing is a lag between their policies and statements and information and what is getting worked out in real time between all these people. So there's an information lag problem, and there's a institutional crisis, I think, and an administration crisis as well, in terms of what people are asking to be done. And they would be two main effects that I'd love to talk about.
Well, Immad, why don't you talk about what's most interesting to you, put it on the table, and then we'll dive deep into all the topics.
Yeah, I try to be positive and optimistic about it. I think we all imagined that there was someone at the top, maybe at the CDC or something, that had these kind of really cool screens where they'd done scenario analysis of every response they could have, and how when you see it in movies, it's this many people get infected, this many will die if we do this kind of thing. I don't know, maybe they just don't do that, but it doesn't seem like they do it, right? They're not at all, even now, I think it's around 50% of the US is on the lockdown, and I haven't seen anyone propose a real plan for how we get out of this, right? There isn't let's deploy masks to everyone, let's do testing at borders, there's a bunch of things that I think to people, it seems obvious, but there isn't this kind of centralized planning. And if anything, there's kind of this decentralized lobbying to get this stuff fixed and decentralized innovation to improve it. So yeah, that part is has been a bit of a shock to a lot of people. But the thing that always kind of impresses me is kind of the entrepreneurial spirit that, especially in America, people have, and there's just so many people trying to help and solve things. And whether it's bottlenecks with shipping, Flexport is shipping a bunch of PPE, and so are lots of other people, or whether it's I have a friend that's got this website called COVID Act now, which has been helping states figure out how quickly they should be kind of doing lockdowns and things like that. So I think that's been really cool to see, and maybe those kind of decentralized efforts will be enough to get everyone to move in the right direction and quickly enough. So yeah, there's some positives there. I think I would love to see kind of more centralized approaches to just fixing this. it's very hard to have decentralized efforts against a kind of a global pandemic that has a very kind of top-down efforts would work way better, right?
Jude, I want to hear your thoughts, because I think you've been advocating for more decentralized response, whereas, I think the mainstream take is, hey, more centralized governments, can act much quicker, more effective, get things done easier. And that's sort of the big debate that we're having. The U.S. seems to have, worst of both worlds in a number of cases. But Jude, I'm curious to hear you sort of go off a little bit on decentralized versus centralized and which for where.
Sure. So I actually want both. So I completely agree with Immad that I want to see a really strong centralized approach, and I want to see a really strong decentralized approach. And then ideally, the communication is great between all sides, such that the strategies end up locking into each other. So if the government, say, hey, we want to solve these problems, who can do it? then these decentralized companies and the market mechanism can kick in and say, yeah, we'll do it. What's the budget? And the two have different kind of two groups have different properties, and ideally they work together, the centralized and decentralized, to produce a better solution. But we've seen a real failing on the centralized approach right now. We've seen a huge lag, and they should have a lag because they have inertia because they're a larger body. But the lag has been really great, and it seems to have been an unexpectedly long lag. We will definitely have a lot of learnings from this about how to move forward here. And I think a lot of institutions that people are going to ask them to be reframed and based on what's happened here. When we do an analysis in 18 months and we say, hey, what's this the best job we could do? We're going to say, no, this wasn't. But the US, to your point about US having both the worst of both worlds, I think it's got one of the best situations on the decentralized front, but because it's a much larger country, it's got a much harder problem on the centralized front to deal with.
And so what does that conversation look like in 18 months in terms of how organizations or institutions should be reformed?
I'm not completely sure, and it depends on what ends up happening. If we end up containing this and everything is okay, and we don't have a wave 2 of COVID, and we don't have a wave 3 of COVID, and the economy gets back on track and it bounces back, then everything is going to be like, okay, we responded, everything was okay. And if not, I mean, the elections are definitely going to play into this, and I'm not any kind of political commentator, but the way that the administration handles this will definitely affect the probability of getting back in or not. So in 18 months' time, I think people are going to be questioning what happened here, who made the right calls, who made the wrong calls, and it will go back into their election cycles probably. At least I would hope it would, that there would be a mechanism of correction occurring based on who had failing strategies and who didn't. I think there's going to be a lot of movement of people as well. I think a lot of people will move country, and they're going to move countries to countries that actually responded well. And we've already seen people have talked about movement from the Bay Area in the run-up to COVID just based on pricing. But now if people are going to be shifting around the world and moving to places, we know people that have got on planes and gone to Singapore, for example, and got out of the USA, worried about the response that was going to occur. So we may see a brain drain for at least a capital drain as well for people moving to other places that was already getting accelerated by work from home and tech being everywhere and like incubators being everywhere and talent being everywhere and lower prices elsewhere. We may see it from a risk dimension now where people want to move to different places based on what happened here.
I think like a lot of things we're seeing with COVID-19 are, everyone knew there was these underlying problems in kind of America, and a lot of them are being kind of brought to the surface. Like everyone knew like the lack of healthcare was a serious issue, right? The fact that like it's very hard to get preventative care if you don't have health insurance, and I think it's like, is it like 40% of people don't have health insurance or something insane like that? So like, that's massively exasperated when there's like a global pandemic. Everyone knew the FDA is like impossible to work with and it's very hard to get things done and approved. Everyone knew that like the government has been underfunding kind of basic research. Maybe everyone didn't know that the CDC couldn't respond to a global pandemic very fast, and like that could be improved. But I think a lot of these things actually, like these underlying kind of problems in the system, and when you have like this kind of large force multiplier kind of applied to them, you see them like, suddenly there's like massive kind of light on the fact that there was these underlying issues. So I think the positive take is a lot of the time, it takes a while for us to respond, but I think in hindsight, hopefully we can reform some of these kind of institutions and underlying kind of societal problems, and then, come out of this like going, okay, maybe we should provide kind of better healthcare that's not like ridiculously expensive in the US, and we can learn from what other people do and be in a position that if this does happen again, we can react quicker and be kind of at the forefront of a reaction to this.
Totally. Jude, were you going to jump in? Sorry.
Yeah, I had a few ideas off the back of that. So it's pretty clear that we're going to have to reorient our supply chains. So supply chains are very fragile. So we've got these extreme efficiencies that we built with the supply chains, and we're going to have to now think about buffering different kinds of products and stockpiles to handle this or handle other kind of global situation. Also, I think we may see like acceleration of privatization of certain functions that we previously had centralized, inefficient in a centralized manner, and we may see these pieces like what would a CDC look like if you actually chopped up into 1,000 different companies who could respond like modeling companies that could create the dashboards, and prediction analytics companies that could do predictive analytics, and companies like Flexport who could affect the supply chain and supply chain monitoring problems and transparency. So maybe we'll see a bunch of new companies who will go and bridge the gap here. Also, there's a major narrative that failed in media, in not all the media, but many places talked about this being just the flu, and that Silicon Valley was overreacting and that tech was overreacting. Prior to this, like tech and big tech especially has been in the bad books of the media and the culture wars that are occurring. So tech has seemingly come to the rescue in this particular case. They haven't actually necessarily solved all the problems in any way, but some companies have directly done interesting things, as Immad said about Flexport. So there may be tech may be back in the good books with people here, possibly, maybe not. And certainly the healthcare innovation may need to change in terms of how telemedicine is going to be, taking off, and how, we may have to actually have companies like building robustness into society and people paying for that kind of insurance.
Hopefully everyone's read it, but Nassim Taleb has a great book called Anti-Fragile, and everything said in there really resonates when we see these kind of events where if there's tons of people in the US living paycheck to paycheck without healthcare, if there's millions of SMBs that are in debt that can't survive a month, if there's these global supply chains that break, no healthcare kind of stockpiles, all of these things are basically a fragile system, right? And when you have these it's not been that long, right? We've only been under lockdown in most places for 2 weeks, and we should be able to survive multiple months of this without everything kind of crashing all around us. So I think that speaks to the fragility in the system, and these kind of shocks hopefully get us to a stage where we can see where things are fragile and where we can shore them up for the future.
Yeah, intensive farming is another one as well. So I think there already was a movement for cellular agriculture, plant-based food, plant-based agriculture. And I think we're really going to have that in question now about intensive farming, and whether the risks that we have in these kind of, marketplaces with lots of different animals, or poor conditions where, the immune systems may be suppressed of the animals and be a breeding ground for these pathogens. So that's going to be probably accelerated. And, for the anti-fragile, looking through all the solutions of how we can be less fragile, because we've got global warming coming up, but no one's panicking about that now until, you have 1 million people that have water at their doorsteps and they're running around panicking for land. So I think this is a precursor for some of the big issues that are going to be coming up again. So we'll probably see another pandemic again, and this is not the absolute worst possible mathematical R zeros and delay factors and symptoms and mutation speeds that you could possibly have. So we got to prepare for the next pandemic, and we got to prepare for the slower crisis of global warming as well. And maybe we can actually have more serious conversations about this stuff now.
Are there other trends that you think are going to be accelerated that are perhaps not obvious or perhaps reversed?
I think there's a bunch of startup trends that some of them are obvious, whether it's work from home culture and decentralized kind of remote work. There's telemedicine, anything where you can do something online that previously required you to do in person. I think that trend was already happening. Remote education, remote fitness. I just think this kind of highlights that actually there was a bunch of things you could do offline, and you never really needed to do a lot of the business travel that people were doing. You didn't really need to go see a doctor for something that could have been done via a video chat. So I think those things are happening en masse because these people just can't meet anymore. And I think that those trends will continue. And yeah, lots of people will come out of this and think, oh, yeah, if only I had this piece of software that would have made this education process easier, or would have made this kind of fitness process easier. And I think we'll see hopefully a whole bunch of innovation there. And I think, the current startup funding ecosystem is really dried up, but the only types of companies getting funded right now are ones that actually work in this kind of enforced remote culture. So, companies that are like facilitating working from home or one of these other things, they're the only ones that are getting funded right now. So I think we're actually going to see a lot of innovation around those trends they already existed, but I think this has highlighted how we could go a lot further.
Yeah, and I think we'll have a new age of biotech. So biotech has been, bubbling up in Silicon Valley and other places and getting kind of interesting, right? And we saw that with Andreessen opening up their biotech fund and Y Combinator going into bio. And now, for me, if we see, I don't think we are getting diminishing returns in software. I think it is a bit of a myth, but maybe there's diminishing returns in some kind of web property, the web in general. But the age of biotech, I think, is upon us. So every person now is going to get more and more interested in biotechnology and learning bio. And then we may see a neo-renaissance of people caring about academic papers and academia, ideas, the truth, and actually caring more about the stuff. And also, we've had a pretty, I would say, an apolitical generation to some extent. In terms of people not caring about what's around us and how we got into the situation in the first place. I think we might see a lot of people now want to cut the bullshit and actually just get straight through and say, who's running us? Are they the most competent people around? I think there's also going to be some trends in security. So if you look at the global security in terms of different countries, the power shifts, there's going to be a lot of power shift that follows what is happening now, depending on who are the winners and who are the losers of what happens here. We'll see capital and movements as well. You can already see the stock market coming down, and if this continues to drag out and we have a really heavy wave 2 and a really heavy wave 3, different countries are going to perform at different abilities in this problem, and that will shift capital around. That will shift the currency markets as well. So, and then there's security as well from a kind of the global tools we're using. Which tools are safe to use and which aren't safe to use. So I think this is going to impact everything, almost every single wake of life. I think people also will want to have more distributed solutions to their personal sustainability, i.e., possibly people caring more about growing their own food, having their own kind of solar power on their houses and power packs if they can. And all the time when we talk about these solutions, the blue collar worker is getting forgot about. As in, what are we going to do there as we automate all these things, like automate delivery and have last mile delivery systems. There's this automation push, which is kind of the security comes from automation in a sense, but you cut out the human. That also creates this problem. So there's this. It might segue well into some of the stuff we could talk about, in terms of UBI, UBO, stimulus packages, etc. as well.
Yeah, let's segue into that. How do we think about the economic response to the crisis right now, and what should the response? What should be different?
I think I've actually gone pretty deep on this new stimulus coming out. I think it's good that something's being done, and it's being done at an incredible pace for government to do. I think the big missing piece to me is definitely there's not enough going into figuring out how we get out of this. So yeah, the way the federal government is going right now, we could be on for 9 months. So the stimulus is just not enough, right? The stimulus is very much like a 2.5 month stopgap for SMBs and people. It does a lot of things right, but it does it kind of using the existing system. So at least with SMB space, for example, instead of Albert Wenger had a pretty good proposal, I thought, where it was just hey, let's pause rent and mortgage payments, and let's pause any kind of lending and give people kind of UBI thing, and just kind of freeze things in that way, which I thought was a nice proposal. The current kind of SMB loan is not that. It's much more, hey, let's give a bunch of SMBs money, but using kind of existing banking infrastructure, which is often slow, and it's not clear how they're going to be able to process kind of 20, 30 million SMBs through kind of existing banking infrastructure. So I think it's interesting. It's definitely cobbled together a little bit, but it's, the government's really actually stepping up for people and SMBs, and I appreciate that. I mean, there's obviously some level of I don't want to call it cronyism, but people always going to say any money going to big corporations, there's are they the right people to be being bailed out kind of thing. But yeah, I think it's definitely necessary. I would just love to go and say, actually, a lot of these problems can be solved if you just gave like, $10 billion to like research and other things that like won't cost $2 trillion, but like are actually going to go, actually stop this kind of going on for like the next 9 months.
Yeah, so the rent's an interesting one, right? So the pausing of these things, like, will it be a solution for the long term? So if you look at Germany and Berlin, they have rent control as far as I understand over the whole city, and if you do it only on a certain place in the city, it means that you end up with very skewed markets like we see in San Francisco. And if you do it across the whole place, and even in private commercial transactions, there are limitations to how fast the prices can grow. Maybe you have some kind of stability in the rent. So there's a big problem with rent and humans. That we need a couple of things. We need food and water, living space, and medical. So they're the pieces on the table, that the basic kind of fundamental needs that you have to fulfill in order to do higher level, more interesting things like science and research and art. So there's a question of whether we can get organized enough to produce enough market efficiency to have something like free medical in the US. It works in the UK. It seems to be working right now. The living space thing is a big problem, and I think if there is a shift, there's going to be a lot of commercial real estate are going to have huge problems, including people, companies like WeWork. If people are going to stick at working from home because they're going to realize that, hey, it actually can work, and we managed to pull it off for 6 months. So what's the point of me going back? So some workers will be able to stay back at home, and some won't, and they'll have to go into the factories, etc. So I am interested. It does bring the UBI debate back in, or at least the idea back onto the table. Because if we're pausing it, then what about the people after it's paused? How are they gonna survive? And I think I wanted to see a shift in the conversation from rather than necessarily UBI to UBO, ownership, universal basic ownership, rather than actual universal basic income, where it's you don't really own, you're just getting the output of it, you're not really owning it, and therefore there's an incentive misalignment. So there may be new models that we can actually look at that might be more practical. And on the bailout side for the big companies, in my opinion, like if we bail out a company that's very large that already did move cash off the balance sheet and do stock buybacks, the taxpayer should own a piece of that business at a fair market price. Now, sure, the government has to do strategic ownership and strategic bailouts to keep things that are very important running for the economy, but at the same time, it shouldn't be a complete washout for the taxpayer. On the small company side, I think that's where it's much harder. So these coffee shops and restaurants and all this stuff are going to go out of business. And if you think about it, if they really if they own their building and they could go back and shut down the building and come back later, they would have a better chance of booting back up again. But if they're paying rent, if it's not frozen, they're going to have a serious issue in even booting back up again. And the rent was already putting their business under massive pressure. So I think that's a major part of a concern for the small businesses, especially the kind of retail side of it.
I've always wanted to have Karl Marx on my podcast.
Oh, I'm not advocating that in any way. I'm advocating a interesting optimization for market mechanism where people have incentive alignments. Yeah.
So no, I think it's actually pretty fascinating. Can you? And then a lot of crypto community seems adjacently like some of the mechanisms there seem to be trying to achieve some of what you're talking about. Can you talk more about what it would look like in practice? What could experiments look like, or how could it work? Or just paint a picture of more of.
Yeah. So I mean, the jump. Yeah. So I thought that the UBI thing in general has not been well thought out in that where does the money come from, and how do we align these incentives? So there's never been any really deep discussion on incentive alignments back into some kind of market mechanism of putting something back in, and there's not been a discussion of really where the money comes from, how much they're going to cost. So all these experiments we keep seeing, you can do that experiment, but it doesn't experiment what we need to test, which is how does it work at scale. So I actually don't know. I've not run any numbers or done any modeling and just figured that out. And then the rent part is really super complex, and you can't just come into a system that's already got a certain layout on the chessboard and try and make a particular move. That doesn't work because the chessboard's laid out in a certain way. And I'm coming from a European perspective on this as well, having grown up in the UK. I think Immad also has that UK perspective when it comes to the healthcare.
Yeah. I mean, I would say it's actually not that complicated. Like, we don't need crypto to do it. Like, fractional share ownership already exists. Like, if you give a company $2 billion, that's like about $6 per US citizen that you could distribute through like fractional share ownership. I don't know if we want to go do it all on Robinhood or something like that, but fintech infrastructure has been kind of built up over the last 10 years that like doing something like that, computers are pretty good at counting to 300 million. So I think we can do any of that. I mean, whether there would be like political will to do something like that, and like, there'll be some questions around like having everyone go through kind of KYC and those kind of basic kind of questions. But it's not, I think it's like mostly about like choosing to do it. I don't think we need a really complicated decentralized system to do it. Like, public market shares are centralized systems anyway. So if we're going to distribute them kind of to every US citizen, we would just use a centralized system to do it.
Yeah, and a more controversial area to talk about here is that there's a function of the number of people we end up having on the earth, right? So if we've got a certain value being produced and certain amounts of goods being produced in all the different areas like food and energy and power, and we have more people being born than are dying. So we have an unsustainable model for human growth versus the growth of all the things we need to produce to fulfill that. And it's just balancing, so if you take it to the limit and you say, okay, how far do you want to go? Like, do you want to have 100 billion people on the earth? And do you want the squeezes and the problems that come with that? Or are we going to try and figure out some way to be in some steady state? Is there a maximum upper limit of the number of people that we want to have on the earth?
I don't know if I agree with that. I mean, if you look at most Western countries, they're no longer producing as many kind of people as are dying. And also the rate of acceleration across like, every region basically is like negative. So I think most models agree that like we're going to cap out on the number of humans on the earth. And actually that by itself is a problem, because a lot of like economic activity still requires like more labor. Maybe that'll change in the next kind of 20 years, but I think I don't think we have a problem with too many people. I definitely think we have a problem with like how resources are distributed among them, and what will happen if like capital becomes the main kind of earner rather than labor. And hopefully those problems will be solved by the time they're like super important. But yeah, I don't think we're running out of resources or people. I mean, or space.
Well, I mean, yeah, there's a distribution problem for sure. And if you either solve it on the distribution and redistribution area, or you have to produce like excess amounts for the whole system. That to me is there's also an efficiency, like how far are we willing to push these systems efficiency wise? Like, let's just say the virus, the coronavirus, did come from Wuhan. Was that a result of pushing farming efficiency or market efficiency? Literally, the market efficiency of having all these different animals next to each other to the maximum. And maybe we need to put some rails back on with our international systems in terms of supply chains and security and sustainability. I do hope that like we are moving towards but your prediction there, Immad, is right, that we end up with a certain number of people, because if it continues to grow, these other problems as well.
Well, we've really definitely bent the curve on the human spread, exponential spread, if you look at it on a graph. But yeah, I agree. I mean, there's definitely a lot of problems. I think like one of the problems with capitalism, and I love capitalism as an entrepreneur, but it does it just kind of favors getting more and more. But I don't think humans really need more and more. I think they need like purpose and like like what people really need is not necessarily what capitalism delivers to people. So I think that's, a lot of these problems are like kind of related to that, right? Like capitalism is just always trying to like get more efficiency and get more money, but that's not like kind of happiness, not in like a shallow sense of happiness, but like actual like contentness. And
yeah, are there any either of you have any sort of concrete recommendations as to how to fix for that?
You mean fix for COVID or fix for the whole?
Fix for human happiness. This is a small problem.
Meaning and happiness.
I think like, there is like a little bit of capitalism that helps, I think meditation apps and like, those types of things. Like there's obviously like, there's gaps that they're fulfilling in terms of giving people kind of better mental health tools. And that does lead to happiness. I don't know. There's definitely, I think, there's a lot of things that like technology does do right when it connects people, and then there's places where it breaks. I have a general thesis that I think like every generation, like the next generation gets better at using the technology that was like given to them in the previous generation. So I think like we just have to probably wait a generation to see like what our kids end up doing with kind of all the social media tools and things like that our generation invented. So yeah, potentially a part of it's just waiting, and like I think better tools will emerge. I know that's like a little boring, maybe. Yeah, I don't know. What else? You got some good ideas, Jude?
Yeah, so one of them is GDP metrics, right? So we measure GDP, and we measure all these kind of economic outputs, which don't necessarily come back to like what people want. So we've been chasing these graphs, and the whole society and the economic system is chasing these particular measurements, which don't necessarily correlate to what is important, and that being maybe people's well-being and happiness, that maybe being their economic productivity, but only in a means to an end, right? Which would be that back to their means and happiness, and maybe some other purpose, which might be an intellectual purpose or pursuit of exploring optionality for the human race, which you could argue, capital in itself is some kind of optionality for people. So there seems to be a breakdown of this measurement. Let's just give you an example here. So say the GDP falls, but as I say, everybody worked from home and hang out with their family and talk with them more, and actually, grew some vegetables in their garden and ended up getting the food and looking after each other and having a good time. That's probably not what's happening for most people right now. But if you can design something where the GDP goes down, but people's happiness, well-being, fulfillment, knowledge, arts goes up. And I think that's one problem here. We don't have a way of measuring that stuff. So we go and measure what we can measure, and then we end up managing to that measurement. And that's a major issue here. So we might want to think about how we can start to metricize the other things that matter, and then that will feed back into the people, the administration that helps manage the whole situation, because they've got numbers to work towards as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. I do think there's like a disconnect when when Trump gets worked up about like the stock market. I think people are like, why is the government caring about the stock market, right? It doesn't feel right, but it is like a very measurable daily tool that every second like ticks off like a measure of the economy, right? Like how well the stock market's doing. If we did something like that for like human kind of contentness and happiness, that would actually be maybe a pretty good political driver by itself.
Yeah, and maybe it's going to be possible with companies like Calm.com that you may end up being able, if you get enough distribution and you can jump the selection bias of getting it outside of normal technology users into the mass populace, then maybe you can start metricizing the happiness front. You can certainly start measuring. We've been trying to measure the knowledge that people have with exams and tests all the time, but it doesn't measure necessarily their creativity or whether they enjoy having that knowledge and enjoy having that capability. We've certainly been measuring the optionality that people have. And when we talk about marketing people's 401ks, we're effectively talking about their optionality to get what they want. So that does matter. And having new metrics and having new goals around those metrics would be useful to actually shift to something that's more interesting.
What do you guys think about sort of the value capture problem? Jude, you're working on Golden. A lot of people could, a few people could have a lot of value by, creating knowledge that other people then use to build on top of, and they capture value. But the construct of sort of value creation and value capture, and sometimes people sort of create foundational knowledge, and then people then use to build other things don't capture that value. What do you think about that?
Why don't we reframe it to value release? So one of the things about value capture is it still seems back in the old models of like, I know the intent is well meant there, but if we reframed it to value release, how much value can release into the network, where you're part of the network and you're a supernode in that network because you're the distributor, and you're going to release so much value that it's going to ricochet back to you and you'll absorb the value. So I'm looking at this from new lenses of value release and value absorption could be interesting to reframe the entire problem of value capturing. Otherwise, like, I always get concerned about zero-sum games, negative-sum games, and I want to see like more companies and the companies that I get involved in and back and invest in and hopefully build attempting to be more positive-sum games in a network. And I think maybe investors need to shift to that model as well. That can make everything better.
I think there's, Mercury is a bank, and one of the reasons we exist is because like other big banks have like been in this kind of overly value capture kind of situation where they charge a lot of fees and like do a lot of like lack of transparent things. And I think the reason it's happened in banking is like there's just a lot of kind of regulatory kind of capture and like regulatory monopolies that's just kind of reduced innovation in the space. So I think the main thing that, and it's hard to get governments to act in this way, but ideally governments would like encourage innovation and encourage competition and encourage like breaking of network effects. There's a lot that could be done with companies that have like strong network effects, whether it's like Google or Facebook, which just makes it so it's, the fact that they're like making something and capturing value and like giving value to their users, I think that's fine. It's just when you end up with like large network effects that can't be competed against, it means that when you're not getting competition, that's when like, prices go up. That's when innovation goes down. That's when users and consumers are not getting kind of the best end of that bargain. So I think there's a part of it that's like necessary, and then there's a part of it which is like, it does potentially require like some regulatory work, like make it so they can't like maintain monopolies and be not in spaces that they can't be competed against. I mean, if there is good competition and they're winning, and they're winning because they're providing value to users and consumers, I think that's fine. If it's just like they're winning because they managed to get an early lead and like now have a network effect and aren't doing the best things for their users, I think that's where like we should think about doing something about it.
A few things to riff on there. Like we kind of have these we haven't, current administrations around the world don't really necessarily, they're not really network effect managers, and there's a lot of like fiefdom optimization and what we really need are guardians of the network now. Like if we look at this COVID problem, we have lots of countries putting export controls on their own goods so they can't shift, so people can't leach the equipment out of their own countries, and not necessarily even very optimal syncing of these equipment between the different countries. So if they thought in more of a network manner and said, hey, we're all in this together, we already trade and we need to sync all this stuff together, then that would be interesting if we can get these kind of people thinking in more of a networked way. That would come back to this kind of value capture, value release, value absorption. Like where am I in this network? What's my function here? What's the optimization condition over the whole network?
Totally. Maybe let's segue into how should startups be thinking about COVID, and what are some non-obvious thoughts related to that? Maybe Immad, we can start with you.
Yeah, I think one of the hardest things about startups is like when these situations change and you've got your 2020 plan that you just built in December and you were like very committed to it. I think it's entrepreneurs are like almost by definition like stubborn and optimistic. I think it's worth actually really stepping back and doing like, it's much better right now to go like, what's the worst thing that could happen? Like what happens if, I can't raise in the next 12 months? What happens if the economy doesn't recover? What happens if like my users don't have as much discretionary expenditure and like my revenues go down? And really go like, okay, like what is the worst case here? And like, how do I survive that? Like, is there new products I need to build? Is there a thing that I need to do to extend my runway? One thing I think startups can easily do bad is just not think about extending the runway quickly and effectively enough. So, if you have 500K left and you're burning 100K right now, that's only 5 months. That's just not long enough. I think you want to not do multiple cuts and layoffs. I think that makes everyone in the team feel like their job is threatened and it feels like the CEO doesn't have a good plan. But I think if you need to, and it's a hard situation, but if you need to, you extend that runway like right now and not wait and extend it for 10 months at least, right? In that situation. So I think it's worth going like worst case scenario and planning it all out. If things turn out positive, right? If it's, if we handle this whole thing really well, everyone's getting back in the jobs and everything's looking pretty good at 3 months, that's great. And then you can like rebuild it up. that's fine. And you will always feel bad if you didn't prepare well enough, but you're not going to feel bad if you over prepared and then things turned out better than they did. So I think that's like a very practical advice that I would give people. I think these kind of VCs and angel funds, everyone has gone like way tighter. And I've seen a lot of companies kind of thinking about going to Series A or seed funding right now. And it's going to be a hard slog. It's not doable. Like there'll definitely be people that do it, but especially with so much uncertainty in the air, I think it's better to, wait it out and really focus on kind of building the company and hopefully just keep growth up.
Yeah, to add a few things to that. So yeah, I mean, runway is everything on this one. So there's a stimulus package that some people can apply for, and you got to look into whether it's appropriate for your company. Anything to improve your cash flow as well. So there's probably things you can do to get that improved. Going for more revenue, I would say go for revenue earlier, cutting all the bullshit projects from your company and just really focusing on the thing that's going to really move the needle. Working harder to a certain extent as best as you can without like compromising your immune system and risking yourself to COVID right now. And if you're hardware companies, I've seen some interesting tactics from companies like Astranis who they're a hardware company. They have to go to their lab. And, so creative ways to keep your product moving and your roadmap moving. And they've moved to this kind of distributed model where they can still keep everything improving and working in very small teams. And they're being creative how they can survive it. Some companies have pivoted as well. So becoming more relevant to this market and being in line with either directly working on COVID things or working on secondary, tertiary effects that might come from it, or making something that actually is, parallel to helping people work from home or helping other businesses survive. So I think there's now a lot of money out there as well from the government that's being pushed forward for COVID projects that you might be able to pivot to. I think from the investor perspective as well, really like having those conversations. You may not want to raise straight away because, as Immad said, everybody wants to raise right now. So it's a clusterfuck in terms of investors reading their inbox and trying to get things done, and they're also probably slowed down because they're having to remove all their finances around. And so the raising, when to raise is an important question. And if you're running out of money right now, then maybe you want to do some kind of revenue experiment or consulting. Sometimes you may have to do some consulting to make ends meet while building your startup. But I mean, given that there will be a good bounce back out of this probably, and I think it's still a good time to start a company, start a startup. And me and Emma went through that recession in 2008, 2009 when we were building HeyZap, and we survived it when we were down to zero cash, negative cash, and making decisions that were pretty extreme for pure survival. And we were always told by the previous generation that lots of the best companies came out of the recession. So I do think if you still want to do a startup, it could be a very good time to start the actual product work, and then when this starts to lift back up, then you can get your raising back on.
I think a lot of things that people, when you're in like a long kind of bear market, people forget. A bull market, people forget like the lessons of the previous bear market, and I think those things are like kind of playing out a little bit. So one thing that I've always believed in, and like I think people slowly stop believing in, is like having just a really strong lead investor that has like a deeper pockets and like is kind of back you up in these kind of times. And this is more like a hindsight thing. Either you have it or you don't have it. But a lot of investors and VCs are like now going like, hey, this is now our job to like make sure that the companies that did have good chances, but like now are struggling in this kind of sudden downturn, we want to support them through this. Doesn't mean they're just going to like bail companies out, and they're obviously going to get some equity out of it. But I think the good investors that are lead investors I've seen them kind of behaving well and like not being onerous in terms and like really backing up their companies, and it's great to see that. So I think a lot of these kind of lessons from previous times that didn't matter as much when like all the markets were up are going to matter now. So something to think about.
Totally. You had a post about a month ago, Immad, talking about fundraising. You need to optimize for the medium success case. Can you unpack that argument?
Yeah, I think this is it, right? It's basically actually like a perfect kind of sudden synthesis of the point I was trying to make, which is that, like startups are just not like a very straight journey, right? Sure, there's some people that just hit that exponential and just grow every month for like all the time. That's great. But there's a lot of companies that are doing well, but not like absolutely killing it, right? Like maybe the growth rate is 7% a month. Maybe they've got some like really cool project coming out soon, but it's not like live yet, and they haven't quite hit the milestone. So they're still burning money, but they haven't hit the milestone. Like all of these kind of middle cases are like where you kind of need to, where like basically it's not going so well that like everything is going to be easy for you, but it's not going so badly that you're going to die, right? Like in those cases, that's where actually playing a good previous fundraise can help you. So a few of the cases I talked about there is like, hey, if you go crazy and try to get like, some big valuation in your initial fundraise, you're potentially overvalued for if you don't do extremely well. So if you do medium well, now suddenly you can't get much of a multiple. Everyone looks at like your previous valuation and says, okay, you raised at 30 million, but it looks like you're 35 million valuation company now based on like the progress you've made. And that just, you start this whole second process where you're fundraising with this negative signal. And I think a lot of it comes down to like, what is going to be the perception in the market when you do need, when you haven't quite killed it and you need to like go raise money, or you need to go to your existing investors and get like extra cash. And part of it's like what happens if there's a huge recession and suddenly like all the capital markets dry up, right? So I think there's a bunch of things that are like kind of in this kind of case of like optimizing for the medium case. One of the I said don't have too high a valuation, have ideally a strong lead investor, and like if you end up having a slightly worse terms with them, but they have like a really strong kind of founder friendly reputation. They, the reason these people have like that strong reputation is because they go to bat for their founders, and that's always helpful in these times. Other things, I'm always telling people to not avoid having multiple leads, especially in seed rounds. Like you want to have one person that has real skin in the game, real ownership. Big VC funds sometimes participate in seed rounds, and they don't really care when they put 100K in. They just see that as like an option call for the Series A. But that's not a good option for founders in the case where there is the medium success, and like you go to that VC firm and they're like, oh, I'm no longer that excited about what you're doing, and now you've got everyone else in the market saying, hey, why doesn't that VC that already backed you, why don't they want to do your Series A? And I've seen companies get really hurt by that. Not just in the Series A, that can hurt you in the Series B as well, right? That can be like almost hopefully it doesn't kill your company, but it can definitely like massively hinder it. So there's lots of these kind of little things that I think in fundraising, people get like kind of excited and they don't think about, you're selling this vision, right? Like entrepreneurs are always selling this like dream that like they're going to grow forever and they're going to be huge, etc., which is good. I mean, you have to believe that and you have to sell it, but you also have to prepare for like, okay, what are the contingency plans if I don't get quite to those goals? What's my backup, right? And like actually preparing for your backup is kind of more important than preparing for the great case, because if things are going great, everything's going to be fine almost no matter what decisions you made initially.
Totally. You also had a post on culture and how optimizing too much for one cultural attribute can sort of lead to the negative elements of that cultural attribute. And so it's good to have a secondary cultural attribute that sort of counteracts the problems of the first one. What does that look like in practice in general, or maybe at Mercury? Like what are some examples of that?
Yeah, I mean, that's to be fair, straight out of Hard Things, not Hard Things About Hard Things, but What You Do Is Who You Are from Ben Horowitz, the new book, which I think is like a great book on culture. I think in terms of like practicality, what we do with that is, we have a few core cultural attributes: being curious, being humble, being product driven, and there's a couple of other ones. Those are probably the main ones. I think, how that manifests is like, I think if you take like any one of them, right, like let's say humbleness, right, like you could be too humble where like you don't have confidence in your own skills, and you don't put forward your opinion, and you always kind of go with whatever someone's saying, right? Like that would be the other edge of that. I think it's not always like a stated thing, but we're, we try to counteract it a little bit with, let's say, the curious attribute, right? Like we're looking for people that are interested in problems, that try to get to the first principles kind of why that problem is, and like they will, they have an opinion about things, right? So finding, and like those attributes are sometimes hard to find, right? Like someone who is humble and like not super ego driven, but at the same time is like kind of has opinions about things and is curious and wants to solve things, right? So I think there's like a balance, and like, we don't necessarily have it perfect, but there's a balance of like cultural attributes that you need to have, and you need to kind of be true to them, right? Like if the leadership is like much more kind of alpha, wants to be like really forceful, I mean, that can work, right? Like there's plenty of cultures that are like that. So I think like you don't want to take someone else's model and like fit it to you, but I think if it comes from the top and like there's this like strong belief that these are the cultural attributes you want, you kind of have to think a little bit further and go, okay, this is what I want. Like I want a smart person, but I also want them to not like be kind of dismissive of other people's ideas, for example. So like you just need to think a little bit further, like what would the most myopic person that followed this culture, like what would be the downside of having that person? And then you need to go, okay, like how do I counter that downside? And I think any attribute has like a trade-off, right? Like there's nothing in life is just like pure positive. So you just need to think about like what's the most extreme negative of that and how I counteract that.
Totally. I want to zoom out a little bit and go back to our topic of how we started this call, decentralization and centralization. Jude, I'm curious, more thoughts and frameworks for how to think about, how they both work together, whether it's at the level of the economy or the level of a company. What are some frameworks or ways to think about that sort of tension or collaboration?
Sure. I like boiling this down into a network kind of diagram of all these different nodes of people in this economy that can, come up with interesting innovations and help each other. And then we have the kind of transfer objects that move over this giant network between the nodes, which are like the money and the goods transfers and the ideas and the information. And then there are super nodes of like structures in there that we all have to, that inherit properties from their rule sets, say from the government. And it's kind of like the network manager of the whole thing, which is the administration. And the network manager, can only do certain moves. And the individual nodes can do certain moves as well in this kind of game. And I also kind of like to model it as kind of almost as a game, right? And I don't mean game in the sense of like Call of Duty. I mean game as a kind of game theoretic type model. So for me, there's like, out of this model, you can start like popping various properties in there and saying, what happens if we have gatekeepers at these super nodes that could, that prevent, right now I can't go and get my contact lenses because I haven't, in the USA, you have to go back in every year to check that the prescription is the right prescription. But guess what? It hasn't changed in 7 years. And in the UK, I can just turn up and go and get and pick up my prescription for my contact lenses. So right now I have to do a physical interaction with someone when we're supposed to be social distancing in order to pick up my contact lenses. So the gatekeeper, I think there's an interesting trend here that we may see. We're seeing the unbundling of the gatekeepers, and we're seeing the kind of fall of the gatekeepers, where lots of rule sets have been put in place by gatekeepers to protect themselves and actually provide inertia to a more distributed response. And we see this with ventilators and the FDA. People trying to do 3D printing on ventilators, and in Italy, when you put someone to the edge, and people start throwing out all the rules, and they say, we got to get the ventilators made, so just 3D print them. I don't care if they're EU approved or whatever. This person's about to die, and we need a solution right now. So FDA has been moving. They've got their compassionate grounds type language for using some of these more experimental drugs, where there's no other choice. You either try something or the person will die. So I think this crisis is making us question these different rules that we have in place, and some of them we just accept. And there's not enough activation energy in the network to bother to try and lobby to remove this contact lens or this glasses prescription rule, which has a reasonable counter argument for why you should keep it. It just doesn't seem to be needed in Europe. I think we're going to see people question many of the rules in front of us, and we have to have a better syncing between the network nodes, the super nodes, and the network administration, i.e. the administration. And to Immad's point about this culture, I guess it's Ben Immad explaining Ben's point as well. I was thinking while you were walking that idea through that, why do we not vote on some of the cultural properties we're looking at for some of the people that are running the centralized system. So we're not defining the characteristics of the centralized system in the ways that maybe we should be. We go after a person, an individual. Maybe we should be looking at characteristics that would be optimal for running this whole network, and what is optimal for the decentralized approach as well.
Jude, are you really into the idea of futarchy? Like, should we run companies or society by prediction markets?
I haven't thought it through much. I prefer run it like we're running it right now, and suggest tiny little changes that add up to being something better. So iterate rather than do large fundamental radicals. I think the experiments of the past in history have shown that the radical changes don't really work. There's too much of a shock to the network. So I'd like to think of it more as an organism where you make these small changes, mutations or whatever, and you improve to a better kind of evolved state. Do you want to walk through the idea and we can maybe pick it apart live?
Oh, sure. So basically the idea, let's say at a company level, or you were talking about voting on culture. One example could be voting on whether the CEO should be fired or whether we should keep a CEO. So right now, the board gets together and they say, hey, 4 of 8, 7 of us think that the CEO should be fired. Let's fire the CEO. In a futarchy world, you could imagine sort of polling, all the employees at the company or the employees who matter, and saying, hey, if the CEO is at this company, what do we think the return, the state of the company will be in a year from now? You put a bet on that. Versus if the CEO is replaced, what do you think the company will be at a year from now? And if
interesting, okay,
they all unanimously, yes, sort of leveraging the wisdom of the crowds and skin in the game.
All right, so I got a few positions on this. I don't think consensus works very well for product development or making radical. By the way, when I said I didn't want necessarily radical network shifts, I do want to see radical product shifts, because they're kind of like one node in the game. So the node can be radically redesigned, a new product, and that sometimes requires one brain to really go through everything and come up with something completely new. So I don't think the iPhone would have been made via consensus, and I don't think penicillin would have been discovered by consensus. So there's something there around the consensus, i.e., there's an activist investor that wants to fire Jack Dorsey. That's probably it's probably the wrong thing to do for Twitter. And that's really one node versus another node. But I don't think necessarily having democratic voting on what is for a problem set that requires sometimes one person to go and lead and go directly through to a solution. On the prediction market front, it's a little bit more interesting, right? In that they got skin in the game. So you've added that component into there, where it's, which is more direct. Well, maybe they don't have skin in the game with the prediction market, but with some of them you could add skin in the game. And then wisdom of the crowds is a good phenomenon. Like they are good at picking certain things, like if you try to estimate the number of marbles in a jar, and using wisdom of the crowds does get to the right answer. I don't think it gets to the right. I think the model breaks down when you add in many more dimensions, i.e., a product, making a radical product spec where the dimensions go to 1,000 and there are constraints and these dimensions play off each other. Something becomes quite difficult there, where you can't break away those dimensions and try and do wisdom of the crowd to predict every single dimension that this product should have in order to make it the perfect product. And it requires a small group of people, if not 1 or 2 people, to have a seed of an idea. And so I think in general, I'm not a fan of the idea, if that's what I'm hearing. It might be useful for certain types of things. And then when we look at the stock market, well, certainly people can't predict which companies are going to be the best, and people are not super good at predicting the stock market. The best strategy there seems to be index and just wait for 10 years. So unless you've got an information edge, and then it's fine. But the prediction market thing, I'm still a fan of the current way that the businesses work and that boards work. There's optimizations to be done, but I would say nothing radical from my perspective.
I think sometimes people rely on capitalism a bit too much, and we can already see there's so much misinformation, whether it's around COVID or kind of Brexit in the UK. I think people are too influenced by these things. I would like to see a world where kind of scientists and experts that have really thought about things are the ones that make decisions in their domain at least. And they can, I don't know how we get to that world, but that's the people that should be leading decisions when it comes to kind of getting this virus under control should be epidemiologists that have shown that they understood it, and then they have foresight and and are working on it. It shouldn't necessarily be politicians that were like pretty good at campaigning and raising money from donors. Like, we're not necessarily optimizing for the right decision-making skills when it comes to these things. So I don't know how we get to that world, but I would love to see the right people making the right decisions.
Yeah, money in politics is a big problem. So if we talk about skin in the game is an interesting attribute here, and putting cash in the system there seriously breaks down this what should be like pure, really good ideas to represent your kind of constituents and stuff, as opposed to people giving you money who have special interests. So there's definitely something wrong with the mechanism of which we pick people to manage the like centralized part of the system. And then there's certainly in the network model, it's kind of like, the efficiency, it's looking for efficiency in a network. It's looking for that kind of capitalist efficiency. It's just in the capital framing, in the capitalist framing, we're framing it with certain outcomes, which is not necessarily, hey, maximize the overall network value and all the interchange value and specific node minimum thresholds. And I think we never see any rigor in the conversation when we talk about all these frameworks in terms of people actually talking about the conditions that we really want. And everybody's always on different pages with the model. So, I feel like you end up with different kind of sets of people having arguments about definitions, and they latch on to old ideas, and we don't make too much progress on this. But maybe there's going to be new thinking after COVID.
Yeah. It's interesting. Arnold Kling had this sort of post talking about the financial crisis, or this idea of aligning knowledge and power, where basically the people that were closest to the data were furthest from the decision-making process. And it seems like that's here too. And it's, if you have a centralized process, you need to sort of immediately shift to get those right people, in a decentralized way, like i.e. markets typically filters for experts, in the sense of it gives them the resources.
Yeah, and the governments are also in the marketplace as well, because people now can move. You can fly anywhere in the world. Well, after COVID, you can for around $1,000, and that's still a lot of money. But that could continue to fall. You would imagine with some radical or new aviation technology, that taking a flight will just be like walking, riding on a bike or something. So we could end up in a situation where flights are cheap. And that could mean that, and also relocating could become, I think it could become ever cheaper and more normal. And that could mean that, these governments have to compete for constituents and power and economic power and produce. And right now, most people can't move. They can't just jump on a plane and change. But I can imagine that happening where, new states like make new rules that are really good, and people go move there, and new companies are formed, and values formed, and the money moves, and more people move. So I think we're going to see a lot more competition between the governments, and that means they have to keep innovating their model to represent their constituents in a better way.
Totally. Earlier we were talking about how to modify capitalism for meaning and happiness on the Immad's thread, and you asked how would I modify it for COVID, and I want to ask if there are any sort of other things we haven't yet talked about that you might find interesting. For example, one thing I might find interesting, not necessarily COVID specific, but does address some challenges with capitalism on the equality front, is basically some version of basically just to popularize tokens, in the sense of when Facebook, the next Facebook or the next Google or the next whatever software product that leverages data that users contribute gets really big, instead of just the founders or just the employees having serious upside from that, the users having upside too. And so that way, when we wouldn't have sort of animosity towards billionaires, we would have or these companies that they represent, we would be excited that they get big, because everyone's an investor, everyone gets big too, which is I think that was the Karl Marx dream, to bring it back full circle, that 99 instead of 1% capital, 99% labor, it's 99% capital. I'm curious what you think of that idea, or if there are any other sort of modifications or ideas you might implement that we haven't yet discussed.
Yeah, I mean, I find it still crazy that someone can spend all their money on gambling or stock market, etc. But there's all these accredited investor rules about investing in private companies. I think it makes sense to protect investors, but really all investors should be protected, and we should just come up with a mechanism that doesn't mean that people without a certain level of income, they can't participate in an asset class. I think those kind of rules actually make it hard for companies to do any sort of kind of tokenized distribution of wealth. And I think I dislike kind of like going quite far with capitalism and then making like rules that protect like richer people and richer businesses. I think that's where a lot of types of capitalism have ended up. But yeah, I think it's a cool idea. I think there's definitely, and there's companies that would be willing to do it, and they find it hard to do it just because everyone's like crypto's the answer, but really actually like you kind of need governmental support to do things like this and to do them well. And in some countries, I guess they'll allow it, but in the US, it's pretty tricky. But yeah, I think there's definitely like good ideas there. People have shown, I mean, you saw it in crypto, right? People really do want to participate in the creation of these kind of technology products. And I think if they could be incentivized in the right way, there is like a way to do it. I don't think it's like the answer is always crypto. I think the answer is like, let's think of making a great product that incentivizes people in the right way. And the technology solution is like separate from that. But yeah, I think it's definitely interesting.
Yeah, I totally agree on the accredited investor stuff. So in the UK, it is just not like this, and many other places. And when it's just astonishing to me that you could have a threshold and say you are not allowed to put that money into this new startup, even if it's your best friend, and you even if you can program and you've actually read the source code and you've read the early stats and you really like it. And you're frugal and you don't gamble and you don't waste any money, but you just want to make this one bet on this company and you're not allowed to do it. So that to me, you're not allowed to put your money into it. You could start working on it. That to me is an arbitrary rule, and it seems like we need to move to new standards, which might be the punishment that comes with like defrauding people if you do something bad. And there needs to be maybe some conditions and rules on there. So we got this gatekeeper problem once again with IPOs, and we may have seen some new kind of stuff happening with Erik Ries's IPO market, and there's a gatekeeper problem up there. There's a gatekeeper problem on who could be an investor. We've also got a monopoly problem. So when you play the game Monopoly and you go around the Monopoly board and you've got this $200, you get this reinjection of money to when you pass go, and that makes the game more interesting. So if you remove that, if you make it $0, the game becomes boring, and it ends up with someone getting Monopoly too quickly. And if you increase it, if you go up to $300, $400, $1,000, $2,000, the effects of the Monopoly, assuming the bank can keep putting this money out, the game can continue on, and it can end up in some kind of stable state, and someone doesn't get the Monopoly. So I think there's some balancing and retuning that could be done to keep the game interesting. And if the game was boring, so we do some of this rebalancing already, and there's certain thresholds where if you do too much, well, there's not that interesting, and if you do too little, it's broken as well. From the data ownership perspective, to switch to a different area that you mentioned, that we're seeing this happen in Europe more, where individual users own their kind of data rights from a kind of ethical standpoint, from a kind of privacy standpoint, from a monetary standpoint. So I think that's interesting. I don't see why, when I go around the web, I should be able to make a trade and make a trade with a website, which is, hey, I've got some data. I'm willing to share it with you if you're willing to share me some information or something that I think is interesting. And the reason we haven't done it yet, and it doesn't really work very well yet, is that we haven't productized it very well. And I think it's a crappy solution to have to click, accept on cookies. Do you want cookies? Yes or no? And you've got this horrible banner. That is not what I talk about. So data ownership for users and more ownership about your stuff, but also it being very trade compatible is interesting. And then in the last part, we talked a little bit about this universal basic ownership, and I was thinking that is there me Immad through that idea about airdropping. We were talking on a tweet thread about airdropping people ownership. So I wonder how we can unpack the mechanics about that, because a lot of people are talking about it, but we still haven't seen practical. I don't know, a practical kind of explanation about how it could be implemented and be sustainable and not break the system and not break the market and actually be like motivational to a lot of people. And we certainly have to solve this problem.
Totally. The one last construct I want to finish on is going back to decentralization, centralization. I'm sort of curious about sort of natural laws about how these sort of go. Like all I get from people is there's sort of natural pendulum, and we operate. And I guess a couple examples I'll give where this would be interesting to have a natural law around it is when you think about things like, I'll give 3 examples. One is language. Are languages going to get more concentrated or more fragmented over time? I.e., or both. Everyone's speaking English, or we're having thousands of languages. Cities, next 100 years, are we going to have way more hundreds of Singapores and Israels, or massive empire, or both? And money is the last one. How do you think about any natural laws around decentralization, or for any of those three examples, Jude?
I've had one theme in my head, which is clouds and rain. So the clouds form, and then it starts raining, and this pendulum analogy is that these systems are nonlinear systems. Can have metastable states in certain conditions, and then you start changing up the numbers, and then it shifts to another metastable state, just like the climate can do. So when we're talking about languages, there is a convergence, as far as I understand, on languages in terms of spoken language, and the number of we're actually losing languages over time. But if you look at, say, programming languages, we are gaining programming language over time. So there's different, for the spoken word, I can imagine there being a convergence into an endgame battle between English and Chinese, or Spanish and Chinese, or Spanish, English, Chinese. And lots of people do not want to lose that richness in the way that people speak. And I think my mum was telling me on the phone 2 weeks ago about her professor had gone to the bedside, missed a lecture that he was supposed to give her because he'd gone to the bedside of someone that was the last old Manx speaker, i.e. the Isle of Man, I think, who spoke, and there was the last person that spoke that language. So we were talking about losses of languages happening, and she's very sad about that. But so the question is, if we're gaining programming languages and we're losing natural spoken languages, or written types of languages, then we're losing that for some reason because we're not logging it, whereas programming languages, we're logging it. So could we have better sensors that could actually record all these rich languages and variations? The other thing that's changing is that we have evolution occurring, and we have modification to the body occurring, and eventually we have new ways to have memory, which, like computerized memory or whatever. So that may allow us to actually store more languages and maybe even learn these languages faster. So I think my prediction on this one is that we're going to lose languages, unfortunately, and we're going to gain programming languages as another kind of non-spoken word languages, and then we're going to go into a rebound where we have this Cambrian explosion of new ways of communicating, because we can actually handle it as a human. We may have some universal translator, so someone might gesture you something, and you get a kind of response in your receiving language.
I think there's two sides to this pendulum thing. I think one side of it is when you just kind of mess with the system, it gets better. I know that's a weird thing, but change basically improves things. I was talking to one of the co-founders of Gusto, and he was saying that every year they switch it between the business team kind of being integrated between the engineering team, and then when they're all integrated, the engineers start complaining that they're always distracted, etc. So then they put them on separate floors, but when they're on separate floors, the company feels disconnected, and then they put them together again. So they were saying that they were flipping every year, and I think that's where that pendulum effect is. That there's kind of pros and cons to doing things one way or another, whether it's centralized or decentralized or whatever. And I think when you switch between them, you remember a lot of the pros you had, and then they kind of legacied into the pros of the new system. And then when you go too far into it, then you care about the cons a lot. So I think that's where the pendulum comes in. But I'm a big believer that humanity as a general is progressing forward. So I don't think all things will have a pendulum. I don't think we're going to forget how to defeat bacteria using antibiotics. And I'm not a believer that antibiotics will become ineffective over time. I think we'll just develop better ones and new ones. So I think there's things that are truly progress, and knowledge is the easiest kind of form of progress that I don't think goes backwards. But I think there's concepts that do have this kind of balancing effect to them, where I think they do go backwards and forwards. There's definitely benefits to centralization. There's definitely benefits to decentralization, and that's why those concepts will never leave us. They will always go kind of in back and forth between them.
Yeah, and to extend the analogies here, we saw this with cloud and client side type technologies, right? You can imagine that in the future there might be some kind of device that could sit on your wristwatch that could have the state of the internet backed up for the last 10 minutes or something. So the data would be on the client side there, but being backed up from the decentralized place. And I think we've seen these oscillations between like client side back to like distributed back to client side. Like let's just take the Cray supercomputer. You've got a Cray supercomputer, you're terminaling in, you're getting into the supercomputer, and then you've got your personal computer, then it goes back to the cloud, and then you're doing some kind of SETI at home in a distributed, early 2000 like distributed computing. Then you're back to an iPhone, which is really powerful, and then you're back to a virtual terminal, which is just a screen, and you've got some kind of cloud, machine in the cloud that you're running off, like Suhail's new company. And then you're back to like some other, this oscillates depending on the technology variables. And if we look at offense and defense, if you look at like the sovereign individual, when they talk about defense and offense, about how armor, like physical armor for knights, changed the balance between the power of the king and the power of the state and the power of the distributed power. And that shifted. Technological innovation is kind of this like, mini kind of events coming up, these little black swan events that change the game. And that could be a discovery in technology, usually is, and that shifts it. It can shift the balance between these two states. So then but it doesn't have to be the dichotomy as I think you guys talk about, as in allude to, that it can be put together where we've got some advantage of the centralized state and the advantage of the distributed network, and they can come together. And I think the technology changes that occur allow us to do this, either shift it between centralized and decentralized or put it together better. And I can imagine with some new technologies coming up that we would actually see a kind of more integrated system. And it is a shame to see everyone go on about decentralized systems, decentralized crypto, decentralized everything. It doesn't have to be like that. I think you can have hybrid. There's always a third way. And there's between these dichotomies is one other learning. Look for the third way. There's always a third way, and that's the hybrid system.
Is there anything that we haven't yet gotten to that you think would be interesting to get to or wanted to cover?
I guess everybody should keep really safe. I hope everybody's going to be okay, and we're certainly trying our hardest to come up with solutions and help cross-connect people and solve COVID, and caring about your family and everybody around you.
Is there anything you disagree on relative to the topics that we talked about today? You guys obviously know each other super well, but any sort of interesting disagreements that are worth teasing out?
That prediction on the state of humanity, will we end up in a stable state of numbers of people, or will we end up? I do believe it will go to a stable state. I think me and Immad have a disagreement in how many people will end up on the Earth, as in the prediction models. Yeah.
How many people do you think will end up on Earth?
I really don't know. I got a feeling it's going to be 10x more than your number. So I'll go for
the whole of the Western world is contracting. Even the second differential in India is down. I don't know where are these people going to be. Africa is the only continent that's growing, and there's a very obvious trend that as people get richer and they get more move into cities and out of farming, that they stop having babies.
So I'll start with the United States, right? The United States is not contracting. The United States is
actually the only people that are having babies in the United States is immigrants. If you, across
the population of
if you remove immigrants completely, if no one was coming into the US,
I'm not removing anyone. Yeah, so I'm just.
But this is people coming from other parts of the world. That's not a good way.
Yeah. No, but the actual population in the USA is climbing steadily, and the actual population
only because of immigrants. It's not.
Yeah, I'm not saying that that's not the case. I'm just saying the population of all these countries is increasing, and the population of the world is increasing very rapidly.
Japan's population is shrinking. The UK population, I think, is flat.
Why is it important for you, this distinction of immigrants?
Oh, I think it's because immigrants, that's not they're coming from somewhere else. That's not extra people being born in the US, and I think this is a very big fundamental thing that I think people have this slightly defeatist attitude where they're it's a bit of a zero-sum attitude where they're there'll be more and more humans and we're not going to have enough resources and we run out. I'm very much a believer that there's going to be less people and we're going to have technology and we're going to have a massive abundance of resources. And I think that mentality is really important to have. If you're thinking about abundance, it's a very different mentality than thinking about we're resource constrained and we need to protect our resources. And I think the reality is we've already created a lot of abundance in the last 100 years with technology. We're all living like kings compared to people 100 years ago. And I think in 100 years from now, people are going to be living in even more like kings than we do now. So I think like that's where the world is going, and I think that mindset is like important to have.
Yeah, I mean, to go through a few of those things, the UK population is not decreasing. The UK's population is increasing. The USA's population is increasing. I'm not saying where it comes from. Most of the countries are increasing. Japan is decreasing. Russia is like steady state. South Korea is starting to kind of tend off a bit. So we probably will see at some point a tending off of all the different populations. But even right now, and by the way, I'm pro technology. I don't want to short human ingenuity. I'm actually very positive about these solutions, but we have real problems right now that people don't have the resources. I don't think most of the people in the USA live like kings. We live like relative kings, possibly to, a Dark Ages 15th century peasant who can just about get by and may not get by it through the winter. But I think we got serious lack of resources, at least in terms of the distribution of resources is a serious problem. And I think it's going to get worse. And I think it's just on aggregate, we may be arguing on different bases. There are more people, that are going to be some problems and poverty and stuff that I do worry about. I do agree that we're going to come up with tons of resources, and I think we have the technology and the willpower to make the abundance there. I worry for the kind of the game rules of concentration of the abundance, or the speed at which we get to the abundance, right? And I do want to get there. I do want to get to the promised land of this abundant utopian world.
Yeah, I don't think we'll necessarily agree right here, but I think
we've been arguing about this for years, right?
there's definitely like a misallocation of that abundance. Like I think everyone on the world could be fed very easily, right? Like everyone, there's people that are wealthy that like throw away like food that could feed like hundreds of people just individually even. So I think like there's definitely misallocation of like capital and kind of resources and other things, but the total amount is huge compared to like where we were, even with population growth, and I think it's only going to get bigger, and I think we'll come up with solutions for like how to kind of spread it better.
We're going to get to sustainable. It's like the interesting question is a steady state. Like how many people will the steady state be on this earth, and will it keep like climbing up, and then will we hop planets, and then we kick off a new graph kind of thing?
Yeah. I mean, if you look at most countries, I mean, the US is a big example of that. Like, it's just not very dense, right? Like, there's not, we could probably fit another 10x people in the US.
That's the way I think it will go. There's some interesting stuff around that. That was one of the ones we disagreed on. I think it was one of the main ones, because we've been having that debate for a long time, and it's really hard to predict, like, what will the population look like in 50 or 100 years' time of the world? Like, where will it be?
Totally.
Yeah. I think whenever Jude and I are arguing, we're always off the same page that we want to get a constructive answer. So it's always kind of fun to have these arguments.
Totally. I'm glad we got some of that recorded. Immad, Jude, it was fantastic having you both on the podcast. Thank you for coming on, and recommend startups and listeners check out Golden and Mercury. Guys, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Yeah,
thanks so much. It was really interesting. Thank you.
If you're an early stage entrepreneur, we'd love to hear from you. Check us out at villageglobal.vc.